Save your dime. Fairy lives don't matter today.
In these times of self-isolation, it seems Netflix can often provide us with that easy entertainment we all crave. While I've encountered some pretty entertaining Netflix originals in these times, some of which I hope to talk about later, Bright is not one of them. Despite it having a concept that I genuinely did like the sound of, Bright ended up being a muddled mess that attempts to teach us about racism, but is too senseless to actually get its message across well, and too mean-spirited to be enjoyable regardless. Nonetheless, it's time to talk about it. What went wrong with Bright? Bright is set in modern-day Los Angeles, but with a twist. That twist being that it's a world where mythical fantasy races coexist with humans. We followed Daryl Ward, a police officer who's recently been partnered up with Nick Jacoby, the Force's first orc cop, who is treated with immense prejudice because, apparently in this world, orcs are major targets of racism. The two of them must learn to work together as they discover a malevolent group of elves looking to resurrect the fabled Dark Lord with a magic wand that will kill anyone who touches it unless they are a magic wielder known as a Bright. Now, this movie is blatantly trying to be an allegory for real-world racism in the USA. In fact, this seems to be the main theme of the movie. And that's a problem, because while the concept itself is fine, the execution is severely lacking. For starters, the world the film creates is just so confused and underdeveloped. Despite the fact that this is a world where humans and mythical creatures have always coexisted, it looks virtually identical to our own. While there are some obvious differences like the magic wand or the history of the Dark Lord, it simply isn't enough to give the world and its alternate races a real proper identity. It feels like the fantasy elements are more painted on rather than properly built into the world and the story. And the distinct lack of proper creative world building means that a lot of the racism allegory falls into senselessness. Like, orcs are hated because they once supported the Dark Lord, an incident that happened 2,000 years ago. That's ridiculous. This would be like hating Italians for the actions taken by the Roman Empire. If this has happened in recent memory, then fine. Like, if the Dark Lord had risen to power only 50 years ago, maybe I could buy that. But even so, I feel like trying to justify the humans' racism is completely unnecessary. You could quite easily just say that the humans hate orcs because orcs are strange and ugly and different. That's the basic logic behind most real-world racism. It's driven purely by fear of the unknown and feelings of tribalism, not by desire for justice. But on top of the fact that the setting makes no sense, another thing that really drags down this movie and the message behind it is the overly mean-spirited nature of the whole thing. With the exception of Jacoby, practically all the characters we encounter in the first 10 minutes are just awful. Daryl Ward is not a particularly likeable protagonist, given he seems to resent Jacoby for everything, and his co-workers are so incredibly racist to the point where they legitimately come across like high school bullies. Jacoby is the only character who is actually kind and likeable, but there are two problems here. First, he should be the main protagonist, but isn't. Ward plays that role. If Jacoby were the main protagonist, at least we could have someone to root for against the racist bullies. But because we're supposed to be following Ward, it almost feels like the film is trying to paint Jacoby as a hindrance to him, when he is, at this point, wholly sympathetic, making Ward seem like a jerk. But furthermore, if Jacoby's goal in life, and the source of the anti-racism message, is being a cop, why does this movie go absolutely out of its way to show the police force as awful? Like, don't get me wrong, I know police brutality and racism in the US really is that bad, but the movie isn't even trying to show any positives to Jacoby following his dreams. Instead of the message that anyone, even the most downtrodden underdog, can rise through the ranks and become a cop, the message I'm getting is every single cop aside from Jacoby is a racist and a horrible person in general, and quite frankly, Jacoby is far too good for this place and should find a better career. But the racist cops aren't the only villains. No, this film revolves around stopping a villainous gang called the Inferni from resurrecting the Dark Lord. This gang is run by elves who, I think, are supposed to be a representation of rich people. Like, the orcs are clearly a fairly lazy allegory for black people, with humans, I guess, filling the role of white people, yet the elves' place in this story is kind of unclear. Anyway, the Inferni are led by Lila, who is not an especially interesting or memorable villain. Maybe this is because a lot of the movie is wasted on our protagonists dealing with other criminal gangs who aren't especially relevant and could have likely been written out. Honestly, I can't help but wonder if this movie was originally envisioned as a TV series, because the pacing at times is just completely off, with underdeveloped scenes that don't really feel necessary for a movie, but probably could have been properly expanded upon in a TV show. Layla and the Inferni had potential to be written well, given it seems they were leaning towards being dark cultists. But, alas, much like many other things in this movie, I guess it was just too fantastical, so they mostly act more like a generic criminal gang. As I say, this is a reoccurring problem. Despite this supposedly being a fantasy movie, it treats fantasy tropes as nothing more than a coat of paint. This movie is just a cop drama wearing an elven hat. It's like the people behind it thought a fantasy cop drama would be a good idea, without stopping to consider that none of them had any clue how to actually write fantasy. So, if that's what went wrong, how would I put it right? Well, first of all, as far as I'm concerned, the member of a marginalised group becomes a cop allegory has already been done right. It's called Zootopia. That movie actually had the underdog cop as the protagonist. Ironically, showed prejudice in a far less cartoonish light, and above all else, actually put proper thought into its world building by showing us just how the city worked and how the animals coexisted. This is what Bright needed. Actually give its world a proper identity. Don't just take shallow, rich LA stereotypes and put pointy ears on them like you're making a statement. Come up with a proper, unique culture for elves and orcs and how they fit into the world. There's a moment in the beginning where Jacoby starts listening to some death metal and calls it a beautiful orcish love song. This is one of very few moments that actually felt as though it was giving some unique personality to the orcs rather than just stand-ins for marginalised ethnicities, and I really feel there should have been more of that. As for the story, as I've said, have the Dark Lord be a recent memory who only appeared in the last 50 years or so, but also show that orcs already faced discrimination and maybe joined with the Dark Lord to begin with out of vengeance. And you know what? Just remove humans from the equation altogether. Have this be an orcs versus elves story, with Jacoby as the protagonist working with his elf partner Ward to deal with Layla, who in this version could be a much more interesting aristocratic villain playing chessmaster to her secret dark cult. Instead of her wanting to resurrect the Dark Lord, have her want to become the new Dark Lord, and want to use her power to wipe out orcs and control all elves aside from her fellow loyal aristocrats, and as the story progresses, reveal that some of the police force looking to get rid of Jacoby are indeed members of her cult. That way, you could actually be providing a proper commentary on white supremacist groups and said groups infiltrating the armed forces. This movie, overall, was just a big disappointment to me, because I really love movies with the potential for creative world building, yet this film just really felt like it couldn't be bothered coming up with its own world and the rules to that world. If there's a lesson to be learned here, it's this. if you're looking to combine two genres of movie, make sure you absolutely know how to write for both. Don't bother trying to inject fantasy into a police drama if you aren't very good at writing the fantastical or developing fantasy worlds. And of course, if you're gonna have the main drive of your film be an anti-racism message, then please think through that message and what you actually want to say. And that, my friends, is exactly what went wrong. Thanks for watching the video. I know there are a lot of people who do like this movie, so I would be interested to hear what you had to say and why you disagree in the comments. This was all just my own personal opinion after all. If you enjoyed the video, like, share and subscribe and all that jazz, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Goodbye!